Hi, it's Elisa again. I have Frank Anderson with me today. He is the operations manager for Timpanogos Academy. In the fall, he was one of the entities that requested a hearing to talk about opt outs. And he mentioned something about our student growth percentile and how it is calculated, and how in his school he's seen a lot of problems with the calculation. And so I asked Frank to join me tonight so that he could share with me the things that he's found and share it with you. So, just for your knowledge, the student growth percentile is what we use to determine half of our school grading. If you'll remember in the news, there's been some schools that have been closed recently because they were in turnaround status. And so I think it's important that this calculation is correct because it is affecting lives. And it also, the bill that passed out of committee today, SB 149, that I've been talking about, it will be part of the measurement for the Student Success Act. And so, anyways, Frank, you have some slides for us to see, and I'm going to have you go ahead and start sharing with us.
Tonight, I'm going to show you what SGP is and why it was implemented, what the actual results are and the flaws that we're seeing right at the school level, and how it's misleading the state efforts to try to improve education. Hopefully we can take a look at what some schools are doing that are better alternative.
Great. I can't wait.
On this first slide, this is a USOE, a slide summarizing how the student growth percentiles work. At this time, the slides mention SAGE testing. That's now going to be called the RISE testing. Basically the same test, same procedures with the student growth percentiles. The only difference is a different provider of the test.
That's right.
But as they point out with student growth, they say that it's a way of measuring the amount of academic growth that a student has made as a result of 1 year of instruction compared to similarly performing peers. But as I'll show in a moment, that's not quite correct. In addition, they would say a 50 SGP means the student made more growth than 50% of the students who had the same score the previous year. And that's what that little graph down there is supposed to indicate. Those who had the same performance in 2014, you would then compare how they grew against each other and get high growth, medium growth, and low growth. But again, we have found that that's incorrect. And we found that as we looked at our test results when they implemented the SAGE and the SGP. This is another graph they showed that they seem to indicate that if everybody who scored a 334, if they then scored the next year and were lined up, those who scored 440 would be up at the 90th percentile. If they scored 420, they'd be at the 70th percentile, et cetera, down the list. Again, it gives the indication that a 50% percentile means the student made more growth than 50% of the students who started at the same place. And again, we're not finding that to be the case. So
fascinating.
Let's take a look at the legislative intent. In other words, why did the legislature approve student growth percentiles, and then look at some actual results, what we're actually seeing in the schools. So first, the legislative intent said that the growth component requires schools to demonstrate that all students, high achieving and low achieving, have made a year's worth of progress in a year's time. So here's some actual results we have. 2 students, TB and NN, both had the same teachers in 5th grade language arts and both scored a 174. Both had the exact same teacher as each other in 6th grade language arts, and they each scored a 175. And these are scale scores.
And they're actual students, correct?
And they're actual students. And at this level, these are high proficient students. These are advanced proficient scores when you get a scale score above 168. Well, TB, his growing from 174 to 175 from 5th to 6th, he was assigned an SGP of 55, which was considered sufficient growth. But NN, who had gotten the exact same scores, was assigned only a 38, which is not sufficient growth. And just a quick pointer, anything below 40 is not sufficient, and anything above 40 is sufficient, and according to the USOE scales. Well, that's kind of confusing, because if we're measuring the same group of students who scored the same thing last year and how they compare to each other this year, it seems odd that they would have such different results. But then here's another very fascinating combination. Student YA, 7th grade math, scored 174, and then in 8th grade scored a 180, while the second student, OY, also scored 174 in 7th grade, but in 8th grade, his score dropped to 169. Wow. So when we look at those two students, YA, the first student who had a gain of 6 points, he was considered not sufficient growth, whereas the student that dropped 5 points was considered had made sufficient growth.
That doesn't even make sense.
It makes no sense at all if you're measuring growth from one year to the next, and if you're measuring the same cohort, the same students who had the same performance in one year are then measured against each other. If that was correct, you would not see these kind of results. So I've been studying this for many years and seeing the same kinds of things happening over the years. And here's what I would point out as to why we're getting such puzzling results. First of all, from the USOE descriptions, it sounds like the SGP identifies students who had the same test scores in the previous year and computes a percentile rank for this cohort of students in the current year. But in reality, no cohorts are created with SGP, none.
Wow.
Instead, there's a complex statistical model called quantile regression. It's called the R program, and it actually uses all student data over multiple years to calculate multiple trajectories, and out of that, it creates predicted scores for each student. Now, the key word there is a predicted score.
Right.
The predicted scores are what the students' actual scores are measured against. So, for example, YA, who went from 174 up to 180, they're not measuring the growth from his 7th to 8th grade math. They're measuring his growth compared to what they predicted he would score. And the second student, OY, in 7th grade and 8th grade math, even though his score went down, it still surpassed what they predicted that student would score.
Wow.
Okay? And so that result, that actual reality of what happens when you implement this SGP program, we're totally not achieving the legislative intent of measuring whether or not a student's getting 1 year's growth. We're also not measuring a second legislative intent, that they want to show success in the education system because it's showing where positive change is happening for students in schools. So each of these pairs of students on the right, they had the exact same teachers. How do I rate that teacher? How do I rate that classroom? How would you rate my school?
It's unfair.
It's unfair, and it's giving us misleading results. But it's worse than that. Because next legislative intent, they said if the accountability system only included proficiency, there'd be no incentive to work with the students that need the most help. And if you've had students with low SGPs, you can flag them for immediate intervention and support. But again, here, look what happened in our school. We had 353 scores that were advanced proficient, which is 54% of all the scores in our school. And we had an additional 161 scores that were proficient. So between the two, almost 79% of all of our scores were proficient or advanced proficient.
It's pretty good.
Pretty good. And then we had 78 scores that below proficient level 1 and 61 scores below proficient 2. So there's about 20% of the scores that in my mind, we would flag them, those 139 students below proficient, those are the ones I'm going to be working with.
Right. Well, that's what the accountability system says.
Correct. But watch what happened. 62% of my non-sufficient growth scores were attached to my proficient and advanced students.
What?
Yeah. So according to, if the legislative intent is to flag, if I see somebody with a non-sufficient score that I should be flagging them for immediate intervention and support, they're telling me I should be putting 62% of my resources to the advanced proficient kids.
Nothing drives me more crazy than wasting tax dollars where they aren't needed.
Yeah. And of course, we as a school we had two options. Option one is actually start trying to implement the legislative intent and put our resources towards kids who are already proficient, or ignore the proficiency scores and do what we'd always been doing.
Right. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And so that's what we did. And then again, there's another level that makes it even worse. Next legislative intent, they mentioned that if you include both proficiency and growth, it would provide a much clearer picture of how the school is performing. But watch what happens here. So you have a bell curve of student achievement. This would be all the scores in your school, in your district, in the state. You got a bell curve. You know, most of the kids are going to score average to the middle. They're going to have some excel, some who are going to need some help and lag behind. And in 1 year, if you look at your bell curve, you're going to be told by the state, according to SGP, that 60% of your kids had sufficient growth and 40% were not sufficient. But let's say the next year or the next couple of years, education in Utah improved dramatically, and that whole bell curve shifted to the right, basically moved ahead in achievement. SGP is going to come back and tell you 60% of your kids had sufficient growth and 40% did not. Or if education actually got worse, if what we're doing isn't working and we're losing ground, and that bell curve showed that we were getting worse, we wouldn't see it because we'd still be getting told that 60% of our kids are making sufficient growth and 40% are not sufficient. And so that whole legislative intent of making a clear picture, knowing where to allocate our resources, seeing how growth is going from 1 year to the next, it's absolutely impossible.
Right.
And not only does it not work for SGP, because SGP is going to always show, every year it's going to show 60-40 split between sufficient and not sufficient. But also, you're going to always have 3% of your schools are going to be turnaround schools, whether you're improving or not improving as a state. So it's, you know, in one sense, this is the perfect formula for job security for turnaround school companies.
Wow.
And third, the other part that's really unfortunate is the whole SAGE RISE test is not attached to anything. In other words, it's not, our SAGE results are not compared to anybody else in the nation, any other state. It literally has no benchmarks to attach itself to, like you would find with the Iowa test or the ACT test, where you can compare how you're doing with the rest of the nation to see if you're gaining or losing ground or treading water. With SAGE and RISE, you have no idea if you're improving or not improving as a state.
Well, do the students even take the same test?
No, actually, because they're computer adaptive tests, the tests are designed so that everybody will get 50% of the questions wrong. So if I start answering a lot of the questions correctly, it'll keep giving me harder and harder questions until I start missing them. Vice versa, if I'm missing questions, it'll start giving me easier questions until I start getting them right. And so when those tests are done, no two students have taken the exact same test.
And which version is quicker?
Right. The idea is computer adaptive is quicker and supposed to be more accurate. But
no, I mean, as a student, I'm taking a test and I don't really want to be there. Which version is quicker?
Gotcha. Well, the quickest way, just start answering questions wrong, because you'll start getting easier questions. And then you know, a lot of the feedback I get from students at our school that have taken the SAGE computer adaptive test is they feel very frustrated because they don't feel, no matter whether they're highly proficient or not proficient at all, they feel stymied because they feel like the test is not something they're doing well on.
Wow.
So there's a lot of reasons not to like SGP and a lot of reasons why we shouldn't be using it. It leads us in the wrong direction. It gets us to focus on the wrong things, and it really doesn't give us any results that help us.
Clearly.
So here's an interesting thing that kind of shows why the SGP is really not working. And to be honest with you, probably SAGE isn't working, computer adaptive testing isn't working. So back in 2008, we had the results reported for our NAEP tests. which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They have schools all over the country taking this in 4th and 8th grade throughout the entire United States. And then they give you your scores back. So back in 2008, according to NAEP, 61% of our 4th graders and 69% of our 8th graders were not proficient in math.
Okay.
And 65% of 4th graders and 68% of 8th graders were not proficient in reading.
And this is during the No Child Left Behind era, correct?
Correct. Because actually when the results were reported in 2008, that was actually for the tests that were done in 2007. Okay. They do the tests every 2 years and then release the reports the following year. In response, since then, since 2008, because when you have 68% of your students not reading and 62% of your students not doing math, it's concerning. Right. So since that time, in 2010, we adopted new standards in the state. They were originally called Common Core. They're now called the State Core, but those new standards came in 2010. In 2012 is when we started the computer adaptive testing, and that's a state law drove that we have to be doing computer adaptive testing. 2013, we got a new annual assessment, originally SAGE, now called RISE. Mm-hmm. Also in 2013 is when they introduced the growth measures, SGP, Student Growth Percentile, MGP and SGT are just other ways of measuring those percentiles by school or by individual. In 2015, we had a new intervention strategy, the A2A transformation teams for the turnaround schools, the bottom 3%. And in 2016, they started a new early literacy plan with the DIBELS testing, which is now called Acadians. I'll do a side note. The DIBELS test is the one test that I've seen has promise that may ultimately show results in the long term. But here we've done all of those things since 2008. And then the question is, how are our results 10 years later? Well, in 2018, the results from the NAEP tests showed that 59% of our 4th graders and 62% of our 8th graders were still not proficient in math. And 55% of 4th graders and 62% of 8th graders were still not proficient in reading. And so essentially we're flatlined. And so here, if you take a look, these are the NAEP scores from 2010 through 2018, 4th and 8th graders. That red dotted line would be if you had half of your students, 50% proficient. If you take a look at the lines for 4th and 8th grade math, 4th and 8th grade reading, it's essentially flatlined. Wow. But then we have an interesting dilemma, and I call it the sufficient growth disconnect. Okay. So taking again, look at these NAEP scores from 2012 to 2018, essentially flat. Back in 2013, we had our first SGP, Student Growth Percentile results, and we reported to the state, or the state USOE reported to the board and to the legislators and to the community that 60% of your kids had made sufficient growth. Great. And in 2014, 60% made sufficient growth. 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, every year, wow, we're told 60% of our kids are making sufficient growth. Yet when NAEP comes in and tests our kids every 2 years, we're not making any growth. So there's a definite disconnect there that the best you can say is that the SGP is not reflective of reality in the classroom.
Right, and how do you decide which test is more accurate?
Well, here's what I would say. The problem, as I showed when we were looking at those bell curves, those could be going up or down. We'd have no idea whether we are improving overall as a state or not improving overall as a state because it's not benchmarked to anything. And they can come in and adjust the scale scores at any time as well. I don't know if you remember this, but a few years back, after they were doing school grading, they announced the school grades had gone down, but they made a point of saying that's only because they had adjusted the scales, right, and the scale score. So on the other hand, tests like the NAEP test, the Iowa Basic Skills test, the ACT test, you can compare those from year to year, from state to state, from grade to grade, and see how you're doing against the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I have to just throw in a little something. in 2012, I was studying the Blueprint for Reform, which, you know, everyone labeled Common Core, but it was much larger than that. And there was a governor's implementation guide. And in that, it said that they were going to need to change all of their cut scores, which is exactly what you're describing here. And
Correct.
my big argument has always been that we changed the measuring stick at the exact same time that we changed what was to be measured. And so we're patting ourselves on the back saying, look at how great we are, but we don't even really know because we changed what we were measuring the same time we changed what the measuring stick looked like.
Correct. So and then you have this interesting dilemma. So prior to the SGP being added to the school grading, as you remember, we had 79% of our scores were proficient or advanced proficient, but because the SGP, we weren't showing, quote, sufficient growth because of, again, those scores are incomprehensible or incongruent. We ended up only a C. They gave us a letter grade of C, even though 80% of our kids were proficient and advanced proficient because we weren't showing growth. Very frustrating.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So, you know, you asked the question about tests and how good they are. I actually have a couple slides here on alternative achievement measures.
Okay.
And if we look at our school, Timpanogos Academy, we're a K through 6 elementary. Back in up until 2009 in Alpine and 2010 in Utah, every school in Utah had to take the Iowa tests in 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th grade.
I remember.
And those scores would then be reported back as the median score, the median average score by grade and by school and by district. And this chart here on this slide shows how we compared to Alpine School District, which Timpanogos Academy is located within the boundaries of Alpine, and Utah statewide. The blue line is our scores for our composite scores for 3rd grade through 2010. And the kind of maroon is Alpine School District and the orange is Utah. All the years that we took the Iowa test, we averaged 10.5 percentiles higher than the Alpine district when you looked at all of our test scores across the board.
Incredible.
An average of 17 percentiles higher than Utah statewide and 26 percentiles higher than the nationwide average.
Wow, it's amazing.
And so you at that time, you were comparing Timpanogos Academy to every school in Utah and also comparing us to the nation. We had a benchmark to attach it to. Well, in 2010, Utah and Alpine District stopped administering the Iowa tests. We at Timpanogos Academy, because we knew how we were benchmarking at that time, we looked at the SAGE test and the SGP and saw that it wasn't benchmarked anywhere. So we continue to pay for and administer the tests, and these are our test results, 3rd grade composite, continuing all the way up through 2018.
Amazing.
And in 2018 as a whole, when you look at our entire school, in this chart, the blue bars are 3rd graders, green bars are 4th graders, red is our 5th graders, and yellow is our 6th graders. In language arts, overall, we were in the 83rd percentile of schools nationwide. And that includes public schools, private schools, Catholic schools, you know, all schools combined that are taking the Iowa test that were compared to with those norms. We were in the 83rd percentile, or the top 17% of schools. In math, we were the 93rd percentile, the top 7%. And math is kind of our shining subject at Timpanogos Academy. We have never been below the 91st percentile any year composite across the school.
Amazing.
Social studies, we were in the 77th percentile. 84th percentile for science and composite. We were in the top 17% of schools nationwide. And we feel that that's an accurate assessment, and it is an assessment that is benchmarked according to norms and standards throughout the country. We feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more confident in those scores. Oh, an interesting thing, there are a few districts we know of that still do the Iowa tests, like Alpine, Canyons. I'm trying to think what the other, Davis School District. They take the Iowa test to decide which of their kids should be given advanced placement.
Interesting.
They don't use the SAGE or the RISE scores for deciding who gets advanced placement. The students who want 8P have to come in, or the, what do they call it? The accelerated learners, the advanced learning. You have to take the Iowa test for those.
Interesting.
Okay. Now, this is grade 3 literacy in Utah. This chart here show in 2014, you can see they were 45% of the kids in Utah were considered proficient on language arts, grew up to 49% in 2017. And then you see the dotted line is Utah's goals. They want to continue to improve their grade 3 literacy up until they reach the point of 65% proficient. They're hoping to reach by 2022. Well, we were at Timpanogos Academy, 72.6% of our kids were reading on grade level in 2017, third grade level. And actually, that was 72% of the kids at the beginning of our third grade.
Wow.
So, because we take the Iowa tests in October, SAGE tests are done at the end of the year in April and May. So then from 2018, the state of Utah, they actually dropped a little bit, 48.6, a drop of a percent, which statistically is insignificant.
Right.
But again, they're not making progress. It's flatlined like we saw in the NAEP scores. And we're kind of flatlined as well. In our 2018, we also had 72.3% of our kids reading on grade level. Looking back at those NAEP scores for 2010 through 2018, this is fourth grade reading. You can see in 2016 and 2018, Utah had 40 and 41% of fourth graders were proficient according to NAEP. At TIMP, we were at 71.1 and 73.6% in our fourth grades. So we're doing well. Our kids are learning. We're making progress despite the SGP and SAGE giving us a grade of C. I think we're doing quite well.
Yeah, you are.
So then a question that comes up a lot is, well, what happens when your kids leave sixth grade? And so our kids disperse to a lot of different schools because, you know, right now we have kids at our school who are coming up from Mona, out in Saratoga Springs, down from Draper, Lehigh, American Fork. We have kids coming from all over. So of course they disperse to different junior highs and other schools when they leave us. But the plurality of our students go to Mazer Prep. And the plurality of students at Mazer Prep are coming from TIMP Academy. And the reason for that relationship is the founders of Timpanogos Academy also founded Carl Mazer. So it's same founders, same educational philosophy. Plurality of our students, by moving from TIMP to Carl Mazer, are following the same academic philosophy throughout. And back to the alternative achievement measurements for Mazer Prep, they use a classical education model. They use the Socratic method. And US News ranked Mazer as the top school in Utah for the last 2 years.
Wow.
And in the ACT scores, which is the grades they give you in 11th grades, and these are the scores that you need to use to get into college. On this chart, you can see the state averages, basically pretty flatlined at 19.7, 19.8, 19.9. Mazer up above that at 21, 23, 24.
Incredible.
All the way across. And then another thing in ACTs, what colleges are looking for, there is 4 benchmarks, and they want students coming in to meet at least 3 of the 4 benchmarks. And so statewide from 2013, 14 up through last 2017, 18, you can see Utah is very consistent. 31, 32% of the students are hitting 3 of 4 benchmarks. Mazer just has been climbing from 53% back in 2013 up to 67% last year. So the bottom line on all of this is there are alternative assessments that are recognized nationwide where you could tell and find out how are the schools doing. And being benchmarked, being attached to standards and norms across the country, you know, the scores are not, you can't just change the scale. You can't change the cut scores or change the scaling or, you know, interchange different questions if you want to change questions and so forth. You're basically measuring yourself against the bar every year.
Right. Fascinating. But it doesn't require national standards to be able to measure yourself against the nation, would you say?
No, unless you call national standards, you know, the ability to read and write and
Right.
count.
Yes,
You
those
know,
are more like a benchmark to me, but like I'm talking about Common Core. Do you think that
correct.
helped create innovation or stifled it?
Right. And so that's an interesting thing, I think, that you bring up right there. Because what we've seen since the SAGE SGP was instituted back in 2012, 2013, again, those tests were supposed to test the standards. The standards were not supposed to be curriculum, or they were just supposed to be standards to achieve. But the schools have been led in the direction, and a lot of them have begun doing it more and more, to do formative SAGE testing throughout the year. And in essence, the formative is basically a way of training yourself for the test at the end of the year.
Right.
And in essence, because of that, it becomes curriculum.
Right.
And so when I see the schools that are struggling with the turnaround schools, and you know, they're not doing well according to SAGE and SGP. With the turnaround, they're just coming in and doubling down on the same formative training. They're not looking for alternative ways to teach reading or looking at how they're teaching math. All they're doing is trying to team build and try to get everybody more committed and more focused on getting those SAGE tests done.
Right. It becomes about the test, and you have
right.
to the test. So
yeah. And so, you know, we don't do any formative or any interim testing at our school. Well, to be honest, our hands are we're full just getting through our curriculum that we've been doing since 2002 and getting those results that you've seen on the Iowa and the ACTs. And wow. and actually, I have one last slide here, and then I'm done with this presentation for tonight.
Great.
Interesting thing I noticed on the ACTs, as I looked back over the scores back in 2015, and remember, if the state average was in 1920 on the ACT average composite score, I took a look. I wanted to know how many schools achieved an average of 23 on the ACTs. And in 2015, there were 11 schools that made that benchmark. 7 of the 11 were charter schools.
Wow.
In 2016, 7 of 10 schools achieved that 23 benchmark. In 2017, it was 9 out of 13 schools. And in 2018, it was 8 out of 8, all charter schools.
Wow.
And if you took a look at what schools achieved that 23 benchmark across all 4 years, there were only 7 schools, and all 7 of them were charter schools.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so there's, the interesting thing is, we created charter schools as learning laboratories. Was one of the reasons that was put forth, that it would stimulate competition and innovation. And we've got schools that are doing quite well, but right now there isn't a mechanism to take what these, for example, these 7 charter high schools are doing, or what we're doing at Timpanogos Academy, or other charter schools that are doing quite well academically. There's no bridge to take what we're doing over to the public side.
Interesting. Yeah, we need to be able to mirror that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating.
So thank you for allowing me to fill your airtime.
Oh, thank you so much. This is just such an interesting thing, and I'm anxious to see across the state if other people are finding the same thing, but I don't think anyone's looked at the numbers.
Yeah, and this is
like that's happening.
And that's a great point, because this is, let me throw this out there. In our school, when we when we had most of our schools taking SAGE and we were getting our SGP scores at the in the early years, I literally was finding hundreds and hundreds of those odd scores. If you recall, where we had kids who had the same score one year and the same score the next year, but one would be considered sufficiently growth and one not. Those finding hundreds of those errors, if you will, or anomalies or red flags. But that's because I only have the data in my school to look at. If I actually had a district-wide list where I could look, if I could look at the data for an entire district, so I could take the cohorts who might have scored 174 and I would find literally, I know I would find thousands and thousands of those errors, those anomalies, those red flags. And statewide, it would not surprise me. I believe we would find tens of thousands if we had the entire database to look at and compare.
Well, I think it's something that needs to be looked at. We're basing way too much on these numbers. More and more bills and laws are being enacted that are dependent upon these numbers and calculations, and it's imperative that we do something about it. So I really appreciate your time, Frank.
No problem. Glad to be here. Glad to help.
Thank you. And I am the proud representative of Timpanogos Academy and Mazer High School. And anyways, I just think they're doing a phenomenal job. So thank you.